I used to believe that speaking out, voicing every thought, was the only way to be heard. My world was filled with conversations, opinions, and an endless stream of words. Silence seemed like a void, a space meant to be filled. Every pause in conversation felt awkward, like a vacuum I needed to fill with my voice. I spoke not only because I wanted to, but because I thought I needed to. To be silent felt like losing my place, my identity, as though every quiet moment was an opportunity slipping through my fingers. My words became like bricks, building up walls around me, fortifying my thoughts and opinions as if they were the essence of who I was. But as the days went by, I began to notice something unsettling. The more I spoke, the less connected I felt. I was surrounded by noise, yet I felt isolated. I was the loudest voice in the room, but it felt like no one, not even myself, was really listening. The realization hit me like a wave. I wasn't speaking to communicate. I was speaking to cover up something deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. There was a noise within me, a constant stream of thoughts, anxieties, and insecurities that I tried to drown out with my own voice. It was like standing at the edge of a stormy sea, the waves crashing louder and louder, trying to outshout the roar of the wind. I thought I could outtalk my own inner turmoil. Then one day I decided to stop. I sat down, closed my eyes, and let the silence wash over me. It was terrifying. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was standing naked before myself for the first time. There was no sound to distract me, no words to hide behind. I could hear the relentless chatter of my mind, the doubts I had buried beneath layers of conversations and noise. The silence was deafening. It pressed in on me, filling the room, filling my head, until I thought I might scream just to break it. But I didn't. I stayed there, breathing through the discomfort, letting the silence unfold around me like a thick, heavy blanket. I realized that this was the first time I had truly been alone with myself. Not just physically alone, but mentally, emotionally alone. It was the first time I had listened to the noise within without trying to push it away, and as I listened, I began to understand. The noise wasn't my enemy. It was a signal, a sign that I had been neglecting something inside of me for far too long. I began to sift through the chatter, separating my thoughts from my fears, my wants from my worries. In the silence, I started to hear a different kind of voice, a softer, gentler voice that I hadn't noticed before. It was my own voice, my true voice, buried beneath the layers of noise and expectations. It wasn't shouting or demanding attention. It was just there, steady and patient, waiting for me to finally listen. As I learned to embrace this quiet space, I realized that I didn't need to fear it anymore. Silence wasn't empty. It was full of potential, a blank canvas where I could finally see the outlines of my own thoughts. It was a mirror, reflecting back my truest self, without the distortions of external noise. I found a sense of peace there, a kind of clarity that I had never experienced before. It was as if I had been lost in a dark forest for years, and suddenly the trees parted, revealing a path I hadn't noticed before. I made a decision then. I wouldn't run from the silence anymore. I would lean into it, let it guide me, let it teach me what I had been too busy talking to learn. I started setting aside time every day, just a few minutes at first, to sit in silence, to listen, not to the outside world, but to the world within me. It became a ritual, a moment of stillness that I came to crave. In the beginning it was hard. My mind would rebel, throwing up thoughts, worries, and distractions like a child throwing a tantrum. But I stayed with it. I let the thoughts come and go without judgment, like leaves drifting down a river, and slowly, the noise began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely, but it became softer, less insistent. I realized that the noise wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to get my attention, to tell me something I needed to hear. I just had to be brave enough to listen. In this new, quieter space, I found parts of myself I had forgotten. Old dreams, forgotten joys, quiet sorrows that I had buried long ago. They surfaced, gently, like whispers on the wind. I didn't need to fix them or speak them into existence. I just needed to acknowledge them, to sit with them in silence and let them be. I found that the more I embraced silence, the more comfortable I became with it. It was like learning a new language, a language that didn't need words. I started to hear the world around me differently too. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was alive with a kind of music I had never noticed before. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a bird, the soft hum of life going on all around me. I realized that the world had been speaking to me all along. I just hadn't been listening. In those quiet moments, I found a kind of freedom I had never known. I didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not even to myself. I was enough, just as I was. In the stillness, I had found my own voice, the one that didn't need to shout to be heard, the one that spoke in the language of silence. This was the beginning of my journey. The moment when I realized that silence was not just a lack of noise. It was a space, a refuge, a place where I could finally hear the sound of my own soul speaking back to me. The world around me is louder than it's ever been. Everywhere I turn, there's noise clamoring for my attention. Notifications ping on my phone, pulling me out of the present moment and thrusting me into the stream of other people's lives, their updates, their crises, their curated happiness. The television blares news of the latest tragedy. Advertisements scream for me to buy something, to want something, to be something I'm not. The noise is relentless, an unending tidal wave that sweeps over me every day. It drowns out everything else, leaving me gasping for air, struggling to find a moment of peace. In this sea of noise, it's easy to get lost. I find myself drifting, carried by currents I didn't choose, driven by urgency that isn't my own. My thoughts become scattered, fragmented by the constant barrage of information. My attention jumps from one thing to the next, barely touching the surface before it's yanked away by the next buzz, the next alert. I become a passenger in my own life, no longer steering the ship but merely holding on, tossed around by the waves. I realized one day, as I sat in yet another meeting filled with voices talking over one another, that I couldn't remember the last time I had heard nothing but silence. It hit me like a revelation. This realization that silence had become a stranger to me, a rare visitor in my life. Even in the quiet moments, I filled the space with something. Music, a podcast, the background noise of the television. I was uncomfortable with silence. I had become addicted to the noise, to the distraction. It was easier to keep my mind busy, to fill the gaps than to sit alone with my own thoughts. But I couldn't keep living like that. The noise was wearing me down, pulling me in 1,000 different directions until I felt like I was fraying at the edges. I knew I needed to find a way back to myself, a way to quiet the storm. So I made a choice, a simple but profound choice. I chose stillness. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a practice, something I had to cultivate like a tender seedling in a garden choked with weeds. At first, the stillness felt awkward, unnatural. I would sit there, trying to quiet my mind, and it was like trying to hold back a rushing river with my bare hands. The thoughts kept coming, crashing over me, demanding my attention. I felt the urge to reach for my phone, to check something, anything to break the silence. It was a habit I hadn't even realized I had formed, the need to fill every empty moment with noise, with distraction. But I resisted. I took a deep breath and let the thoughts come. But I didn't follow them. I let them wash over me like waves, noticing them without being swept away. It was hard at first, like learning a new skill. My mind rebelled, throwing up every excuse, every worry it could find, but I stayed with it, breathing in and out, letting the silence settle around me like a heavy mist. As the days passed, something started to shift. The silence no longer felt like an empty void. It became a kind of sanctuary, a refuge I could retreat to whenever the noise of the world became too much. I realized that silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a space that held everything I had been too busy to notice. In the stillness, I could feel the rhythm of my own heartbeat, the gentle rise and fall of my breath. It was as if I had been living outside of myself, caught up in the noise, and now I was finally coming home. The stillness became my anchor. In the middle of a crowded room, I could close my eyes and find that quiet space inside myself. I could feel the noise swirling around me, but it didn't touch me anymore. I had found a place within myself that was untouched by the chaos, a place that was mine alone. It was like standing in the eye of a storm, where everything was calm and still even though the winds raged around me. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The sound of the rain tapping against the window, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the quiet hum of life going on all around me. These were the sounds I had drowned out with my need for constant stimulation. The simple, beautiful sounds of the world. I realized that I had been missing out on so much, distracted by the noise I had thought I needed. In the silence, I found a different kind of connection, a deeper, more meaningful one. It wasn't about tuning out the world. It was about tuning in, really listening for the first time. I found myself slowing down. I walked more slowly, noticing the way the sunlight played on the leaves, the way the shadows stretched across the ground. I ate my meals without scrolling through my phone, savoring each bite, tasting the food as if for the first time. I felt more present, more alive than I had in years. The noise was still there, but it no longer controlled me. It was just background, like a distant hum that I could choose to acknowledge or ignore. In this stillness, I started making better decisions. I realized how many of my choices had been driven by the noise, by the pressure to keep up, to do more, to be more. When I stopped reacting to the noise, I found that I could hear my own inner voice more clearly. It was quieter than the noise, softer, but it was steady and sure. It didn't shout. It simply spoke the truth. I found a kind of clarity I had been searching for in all the wrong places. It wasn't in the endless stream of information or the loud opinions of others. It was in the quiet moments, the still, small voice within me. Now, when the world feels overwhelming, when the noise threatens to pull me under, I know where to go. I close my eyes, take a deep breath, and find that stillness again. It's always there, waiting for me, like a calm lake hidden deep in the forest, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. I dip my toes in, feel the cool, soothing silence wash over me, and I remember who I am beneath all the noise. I remember that I am not the noise, not the chaos swirling around me. I am the stillness, the quiet space where I can finally breathe, where I can finally be. I used to think that the only way to make an impact in the world was through words, through the force of my voice. I believed that to be heard, I needed to speak up, to argue my point, to convince others with the strength of my arguments. I saw silence as passivity, as weakness, as if by staying quiet I was letting the world pass me by. So I spoke often and loudly, filling the space with my thoughts, believing that this was the only way to leave a mark, to be remembered. But over time, I realized something unexpected. My words were not always as powerful as I thought they were. Often, they were just noise, blending into the chorus of other voices all shouting to be heard. I was so focused on speaking that I had forgotten how to listen. It was only when I started to embrace silence that I began to understand its true power. Silence isn't empty, it's full of potential. It's a space where things can grow, where the most profound insights and connections can take root. I began to see that silence could be more powerful than words, that sometimes the absence of speech could say more than any sentence ever could. It wasn't about staying silent out of fear or uncertainty. It was about choosing silence as a tool, a way to communicate something deeper, something beyond words. I started experimenting with silence in my interactions with others. Instead of rushing to fill every pause in conversation, I began to hold the space, letting the silence linger a little longer than felt comfortable. At first, it was hard. I felt the urge to speak, to say something, anything, to break the tension. But I resisted that urge. I realized that in those moments of silence, something was happening. People were taking a breath, gathering their thoughts, processing their emotions. The silence wasn't awkward, it was necessary. It was a space for things to unfold naturally, without the pressure of words. I noticed that when I stayed silent, when I really listened, people began to open up in ways they never had before. They felt seen, understood, not because of what I said, but because of the space I created for them. I realized that silence wasn't just about not speaking. It was about being present, about giving my full attention to the moment and the person in front of me. It was about listening with my whole being, not just my ears, but with my heart, my intuition, my entire self. It was a way of saying, I'm here with you, fully and completely, and you don't need to say anything for me to understand. In those moments, I discovered a new kind of connection, deeper than any conversation I had ever had. It was a connection that went beyond words, beyond the superficial layer of what we usually talk about. It was a connection of presence, of shared silence, where everything unnecessary fell away, and all that was left was the truth. I found that in these quiet spaces, I could sense the unspoken feelings, the undercurrents of emotion that words often can't express. I could feel the pain behind a smile, the hesitation in someone's voice, the longing in their silence. And instead of trying to fill that space with my own words, I let it be. I let the silence hold it. I started to notice that the most profound moments of my life had been marked by silence. The silence of a shared sunset, when words would have only taken away from the beauty of the moment. The silence of holding someone's hand during a time of grief, when no words could possibly capture the depth of the pain or the comfort of simply being there. The silence of looking into someone's eyes and knowing without a doubt that you are understood, that you are loved. These moments didn't need words. In fact, words would have only diminished them. I realized that silence has its own voice, one that speaks directly to the soul. It's a voice that doesn't need to explain, justify, or persuade. It simply is. It holds space for everything we cannot put into words, the deep, indescribable parts of our experience that language can never fully capture. I learned that silence could be a gift, a way of honoring those moments, those feelings, by not trying to define them, but by letting them be in all their raw, messy, beautiful complexity. As I embraced this new understanding of silence, I began to find my own strength in it. I no longer felt the need to prove myself through my words, to argue or defend my point of view at every turn. I realized that I didn't need to have the last word, or even any words at all, to make an impact. My presence was enough. My silence could be enough. I found a quiet confidence in knowing that I didn't need to speak to be powerful. In fact, my silence could sometimes carry more weight than my words ever could. There were moments when I chose to stay silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that my silence would speak louder. In a heated argument, when emotions ran high, I found that my silence could be a balm, a way to de-escalate the tension, to offer a space for reflection instead of reaction. In a difficult conversation, when the other person was struggling to find their own words, my silence was a way of saying, "Take your time. I'm here. I'm listening." Silence became my way of speaking the unspeakable. It was my way of expressing the things I didn't have words for. The depth of my gratitude, the fullness of my love, the complexity of my pain. It was a way of honoring the parts of myself and others that couldn't be neatly packaged into sentences. The raw, unfiltered parts that were truer than any words could convey. I learned to trust silence, to see it not as a void but as a canvas, a space where the most beautiful, honest parts of life could be painted. It became my voice, the voice that didn't need to shout to be heard, the voice that spoke in the language of presence, of stillness, of simply being. I found that in silence, I could hear myself more clearly, feel the truth resonating in my bones. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't feel the pressure to fill the silence. I don't need to be the loudest voice or to say the most profound thing. I am comfortable in the quiet, in the spaces between words. I have found a strength there, a kind of power that is not about dominating the conversation, but about holding space. about being fully present. Silence has become my voice, a voice that doesn't need words to be heard. It's the voice of my truest self, the one that exists beyond all the noise. It's the voice of presence, of connection, of understanding, and it speaks louder than I ever could with words.